It's my honor to be with Mary Haverstick, author of A Woman I Know, and I'm really looking forward to this. Mary, thanks for being with me.
My pleasure, James.
Mary, what was the timeline of the book from when you knew you were going to write it to when it was published?
It was a slow reveal that I was going to write it. I believe my entire quest with Jerry Cobb started around 2009 when I really reached out for her story. My first outreach may have even been 2008. I discovered June Cobb, and of course, these are all in the footnotes of the book and I'll probably be more accurate than what I'm telling you. But within a year, it was about 2 years after that that I got with Jerry, I got in communication with her and was working with her that I discovered June Cobb, and I immediately pivoted to what initially began as research into the question, trying to answer, is June Cobb also the spy known as Jerry Cobb? Is the aviator Jerry June, and vice versa? And that wound up having a rather complicated answer because I think spying constructs are also, often rather complex. But I probably researched it for about 4 to 5 years before it really became clear that I could do a book. Because let's face it, James, it was such an odd discovery that a woman I was trying to profile in a movie, it turned out to potentially have this double identity, which I believe I've kind of nailed in the book that she very much had, and then figure out what that identity was. Why was that spy involved in the Kennedy assassination documents? And then could I tell this story was a big question that arose for me. Could I create a cohesive story? Was it too far-fetched? Would audiences be interested? And this was, of course, leading into the Kennedy assassination. So, it just got wilder and wilder. So I think it took me in the actual writing process, which was slow. The writing process was a good 4 years. Now, frankly, I was trying to make a living with my filmmaking and doing other projects. So I was not just writing. I was doing other things during the writing. But the writing process was pretty long. The actual route to publishing was fast. I think my literary agent, once I got one, said it was one of the quickest he'd ever seen from the submission of the book to the publishing of the book. It was under a year. So that went like lightning. And I think that was because I'd pretty much finished the book, including footnotes, when I submitted it. So it was pretty far along.
You kept obviously some things under your hat for some time then. Were there times over these years when you wanted to shout to the world what you were uncovering?
I did. It was really weird because I'm on Facebook and I have a following here in Pennsylvania that knows me as a filmmaker, regionally pretty well known here. They follow my work, and all of a sudden on Facebook, I couldn't post about what I was really doing. I was traveling around these great amazing trips with Jerry, and I was on to these interesting things about the Kennedy assassination, but I wound up posting about my gardening and just little things I was doing. I think my friends and my followers in Pennsylvania just thought, well, is Mary really slowing up? She's not really doing much. So I felt like my career felt like it was a little bit on hold in an odd way while I was pursuing it. And I was actually a little worried about how that kind of came off publicly. So I was really ultimately relieved when I was able to come out with the book.
How much did your filmmaking experience and background inform your writing process?
A lot. I think because I'd really worked hard to hone my skills, and films are long form stories. And also, I wasn't just a director who directed and handed my movies off. Most of my films, and maybe even all of my films, I've also been the editor of the film. That's kind of where and I've also written my films when they're narratives as well. So I've written the screenplays and then I've edited the film. And I think the editing process was very helpful. There were a couple times where I had to learn more about my craft. I signed up for those master classes, with some authors, and I learned about their process and how they think about writing a piece. And that was quite helpful. But ultimately, there was a fair amount of trial and error, which I think is ultimately the best learning process, to read back one of your drafts, be unhappy with it because it's too clear or not unclear or not interesting enough. And that's how you really learn. You get to the end of a draft you just did and you go, wow, that needs a lot of work. What does it need? And work on it that way.
Structurally, I would say there was a narrative feel to the book, as if someone who knows how to tell a story and has worked in story before. So that's really struck me in how you frame that, how you frame the book as a structure, as a narrative, as a way to hook us in and guide us through the process. So you're very cognizant about that. Is that something that you intentionally sought to do?
Yeah, James, absolutely. And thank you for that compliment, that nice compliment. I mean, one of the things I'm most proud of is that Barnes and Noble listed a woman I know on their top 10 nonfiction, what they call literary nonfiction, meaning good storytelling and nonfiction books of 2023. And I was surprised and shocked and flattered by that. But I did put a lot of thought into it. The first big decision, and I think the narrative driver was, a lot of the JFK books or any kind of spy book or any nonfiction book is often an arm length removed, telling the history in that kind of way. And I put myself a little bit uncomfortably in the story. It was an uncomfortable decision because I was going to have to put the reader in my thoughts as I learned as a newbie about spying, about the JFK case, about the CIA documents. And so me being a newbie, I was hopeful that I would bring audience members along, or readers who weren't used to that kind of genre. And I think actually we brought some women in who maybe never really followed the JFK case and were interested for other reasons, interesting women of history. And I think we brought some readers along that have now been eye-open to the JFK case that before it may not have, really been paid much attention to that corner of history. But yes, I put a lot of time into it, putting myself in the driver. I felt that it wound up being important, like what I called my quest to figure out Jerry, then my quest to understand the Kennedy documents. And many of the chapters have my quest as the driving force. And ultimately my cat and mouse relationship with Jerry, which I think was very important to it. And I think of that as the most fun part of the book. When you read the parts about me meeting up with elderly Jerry and we're trying to figure each other out and I'm trying to get info, those are fun. But then I make the reader learn. I say, okay, we have to go to school now and learn about these Kennedy assassination documents, which are complicated. There's going to be a reward because we're going to figure out a lot about how spying works, about the assassination itself, but we have to go to school a little bit. I didn't enjoy putting the reader through that, but ultimately, you're not going to get anywhere solving this case unless you roll up your sleeves and you start to understand what's in those documents. And they're complicated and obfuscated by design. So that was actually a little bit tricky. So yeah, there was a whole lot of thought that went into, how I was going to present this story and keep the reader engaged, even a reader who didn't know very much going in.
How do you feel the book was received then when it was published, November 2023, in timing with the 60th anniversary of the assassination? How do you feel the book was received? And specifically, how do you feel it was received within the JFK assassination community?
Well, I have to start even broader than that because it was interesting. It got more press in foreign markets because the book also came out in a French version, which went in France and perhaps some other French-speaking countries, but for sure in France. And that was a good Paris publisher. We got good publication in Australia and in the UK. So those countries jumped on with much more overt press coverage than we saw in the United States. And of course, sales follow that, right? So it's doing real well over there and it's cooking. And it got some of those articles that I actually expected a little bit more of in America. Now, in America, we got a pretty big book review in the New York Times, which is hard to get in the New York Times book review. So I feel very fortunate. And I've been told that very few JFK books get that because the New York Times is not one to put forward the theories about questioning the case specifically, and they're pretty. It's a really tight needle to thread to get in there with something that's going to talk about, did our government do some bad things, right? They've more open-minded in the mainstream press to some of the traditional storyline of the Warren Commission. So I felt we broke a barrier. Now, I got a mixed review there, but plenty of positive comments about the book in that review. So overall, that was good publicity. But beyond that, I was a little disappointed that it didn't get picked up more in some more mainstream articles or maybe some TV coverage. We didn't seem to get that in America. We got that overseas. Now, the JFK community is its own world, as we all know. And I think it's gotten, one way I look at my JFK response is this. I'm going to have very few friends initially, because not only am I going against the Warren Commission and the people who believe the lone gunman, so those people are already on a different side of the fence and they've probably baked in their own conclusion. So they're not going to be real wild about my book. Then I have the people who suspect, it was a conspiracy. They might already think they know who might have done it, and maybe I'm even agreeing with them. But I'm bringing up things that have never been brought up before. I'm looking at some of the women. I bring up a radical idea of where a shot could have come from that's really never been posited before by anybody. That means that anybody who liked the grassy knoll or any other angle isn't really going to jump on board with what I've said. So that means that, I'm not with the grassy knoll people. I'm not with the Warren Commission people. So who am I with? I've got very few allies. James, what I'm really thrilled about is I actually have developed some allies. And I knew going into this that it would take time, right? But my book has 1,600 footnotes. I think I did a pretty solid job with my research. And there have been some people who came in with a bit of skepticism, but have, ultimately, I think, had some respect for the work I've done. I mean, I would name Jefferson Morley in the podcast I did there, JFK Facts. He challenged me pretty directly about my a theory. It's a proposal that I have in chapter 10 at the end of the book about the babushka, and could she have been, carrying a concealed weapon, which has really never been brought forward credibly by anybody else. I actually think that that's a very hard proposal to completely debunk. But the work I've done, and I'm a little disappointed, the work I've done in QJ Win, ZR rifle, okay, I have done some solid and extensive work on those topics. I have read virtually everything else that's been put forward on those topics. I think my work is pretty strong on those topics, right? And I haven't heard a lot of discussion on that in the JFK boards. Now, I don't comb those message boards, and I don't, they're going to argue and shake it out, and everybody's going to come to their different feels about that. But I think the longer that sits out there and the more comes out after me, right, and the double identity work I've done, I mean, I think I've blazed some trails. So I'm hopeful I have. And I have received my supporters. I guess I have a few detractors out there. A couple of the people who have detracted, I actually respect their work, and I think their work has informed my work. And I don't think that my work is as oppositional to their work as perhaps they have knee-jerk wondered. They've thought, gee, if Mary's putting this forward, does this debunk something that I have previously said in a book or an article? I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think I've put forward stuff that, as we sift and sort through, is going to be very complementary with many of the other. Nobody's going to have it 100%. None of us. Myself, I know that. These other books, probably not. But we're going to have really good things between us, and let's forge a path with those. So, I'm not disappointed with how it's been received. I think I've gotten some mainstream readers out there, which I think is very hard to do with the JFK thing. I've got women on board. I've spoken to groups where it's almost all young women who have probably never even thought about this case. So we're opening some new eyes here, as well as engaging with the JFK folks. One final thought is, I didn't write this book to just become a JFK person. As a matter of fact, that was my concern. I've always written more about women and interesting stories about maybe feminism and women's roles. So I certainly didn't want to niche myself all of a sudden as just a JFK writer. So I'm trying to do a number of things at once here, and I'm not unhappy where it's landed.
There's a line in the book, though, where you mention, boiling it down, I'm paraphrasing here, where really you were looking for seeking the truth. And you're inviting us to trust you, and if you as a reader, you can read this as a really well-written narrative and enjoy it, but you can also follow you into that truth. And that's where I was coming from, is I'm trusting Mary here as someone who's putting it out there, because she's looking for the truth. And it may not be comfortable, and it may not be the way you want it to be, but that's how I followed your work in terms of seeking that truth as you as a writer, and trusting that you were putting yourself out there and as a vulnerable both writer and protagonist in a way in this book. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I think thanks again. I did not come into it with a preconceived agenda. There are writers that come in, and it's cool for writers who have studied the JFK case and they come in with a strong feeling about it, whether they already have a theory or belief beforehand. I didn't come in with much preconceived notion, and I certainly didn't come into it with the idea that the woman I was dealing with had a double identity. I believe she was who she said she was, and I was interviewing her, even though Truth be told, I did feel some of the disconnect in our interviews when I talked to her. I felt there was a roteness to the way she told her biography to me. I've interviewed a lot of people and it didn't seem right. And I knew there was something wrong. I assumed that the something wrong was that she'd become a recluse and she was very shy about telling her story. So she stuck to what had been said many other times. But I knew there was something wrong. But I certainly wasn't coming into it with those preconceived notions. So I tried to go with, and then I thought, okay, if I have discovered something important, that this woman is hiding a double identity of June Cobb, and the woman I know was the spy who actually did quite a bit of that work. By the way, I'm not saying all of it. I do believe a June Cobb existed and helped her with that illusion. But I believe Jerry was the agent on the case. She was the one doing the actual spying. I think my timelines show that, as does a witness that I uncovered. But that's why I didn't start typing the book until I was probably at least 6 years into the research, maybe more. I wanted to make sure that what I was saying was going to be pretty darn solid. And I could carve out where I was going to be more theoretical, right? But the parts about Jerry being June and what I discovered, readers can decide for themselves when they look at the timeline, when they hear the woman I interviewed who knew June Cobb, but pointed to the picture of Jerry as the woman she knew as the spy June Cobb. So I have a lot of data points, what I call points of certainty. Few and far between are those wonderful points of certainty, like that interview with a woman or my timeline. But I did get those points of certainty in this maze, this wilderness. And the reader is there with me. But I didn't come in with an agenda or a big view or even to be established in the JFK community. I came in to find out what I could learn about Jerry and what she ultimately was going to teach us about the assassination, which she clearly had a lot of involvement and proximity to.
Ultimately, looking back now, how do you feel this process challenged you as an American?
I look right out my window right now and I can see the flag that I put out on my deck while I was writing. I thought, I don't have a flag up and I need to have a flag up, American flag, because too many of us artists maybe don't think like that, right? I didn't come up with a military family, but I was like, no, I'm doing something that I feel is important for our country. And I'm going to put up my flag, like fly my own American flag, because I have my own reasons to feel that this is important. This isn't what I planned for my career, to detour over to investigate Jerry, covert operations, and what happened to Kennedy. But I feel that it did impact our country, JFK's death, and then if it's a coup, if it's an overthrow, who was behind that? What was their reasoning? How did that change the arc of American history? Because clearly that was also the intent. And if that's the case, we have to reckon with that in order to tackle some of the challenges that are before us right now, that we all as Americans, regardless of who you're voting for or how you think, we're all facing the divisions and the strife we have in our country at the moment. And some of those forces are once again at play in various ways. So I think understanding and reckoning with history and not burying it, not walking past it and saying, yeah, it's an ugly episode. Let's not look too deeply into that, which is clearly what the Warren Commission did. I think that did a real disservice. And if you do that in your own dysfunctional family or household, we all know that comes back to bite you, right? You don't root out the problem now, it is going to stay with you. So that's why I felt it was a duty to really spend a portion of my life trying to excavate this story.
There's an editing project that you do where you combine compilation, edit some of the clips of the amateur films that were shot when the motorcade was in Dealey Plaza, and that's available. I'll try to link that. And I think it's helpful because, you do something, you try to construct a timeline in a way for folks to process what's happening very quickly. But at the same time, you as a filmmaker are editing footage, for instance, the Zapruder film, you know, and you're trying to glean material out of a film. You know, what was that like as a filmmaker working on this project with the role of film in this? And then you talk about Life magazine and the official, there's Alkins and there's some official photography going on, but we're really reliant on amateur film to tell us something that's so seismic. As a filmmaker, how do you look at that, the role of film in the terms of the assassination?
Well, there's where I do feel I finally came into my professional element in looking at and dealing with the footage, because not only was I a filmmaker, I was a filmmaker who shoots my own stuff. Like, I'm also a cinematographer and I'm also an editor. So when I'm looking at those films, I understand a lot about the spatial orientation and the lenses that are being used. For example, in the Muchmore film, which is very deceptive, that's the one that shows the babushka woman tracking along, how she pivots, and Kennedy's still coming here, but she's pivoted her camera here. Now, that's something I'm very well aware that you just don't do. No amateur, no professional does that. You don't want the shot of the back of his head. That's one of the reasons I think it's so important to take a look at the babushka and what she was doing. So I felt I was extremely well, educated to take on, having edited 4 feature films, and I've edited all my other short films, and I've lensed and cinematography most of those films. So that I actually set up a camera and recreated the actual Super 8mm. I don't even write about this in the book, but I set up, like in my own yard, a Super 8 camera that would be like the Muchmore footage and all the various points of interest within that frame to get some real idea of how compressed that was on Dealey Plaza. Not to mention I visited the plaza, none of which did I really go over in the volume. But that's the level of detail that I went to figure out how far was she from Kennedy? What was her angle? Why was she facing this way prematurely? And clearly she wanted that shot at the back of his head, which I found incredibly troubling. There's just nobody. If you watch all the other amateurs, nobody goes for the shot of the back of the head going away. They all turn their camera off pretty much as the motorcade gets to that point. So it was extremely helpful. And then another thing about my visual analysis of the crime was I think I'm one of the only people to really focus on the women who are on Dealey Plaza. Because I think when you're constructing a covert operation, clearly there were a few people like William Harvey who knew that if you have June Cobb, and she's involved in the assassination deliveries to Juan Orta, who was trying to kill Castro, June Cobb can be much more invisible. And okay, this is where I feel that my book is really important to challenge the existing conspiratorial narrative in JFK, in the JFK assassination community. I mean, all the other theories have some burly man coming in with a long gun to the plaza. Well, we all know how it's not a great plan. Right? I mean, that's not a great plan. So you got either position a guy with a long gun way off in the hinterland on like the overpass, or way back in the Daltex spill, some other window. Well, you have Oswald taking his shots, then laying down his gun in a real obvious way. So having a second weapon which is concealed completely, not just a burly guy behind the fence, but a small concealed weapon, which if you just go to the Spy Museum or just Google, you'll find out, there's been lipstick guns that were created before this. So a camera gun is not a long shot idea. So following the movements of the women, they could be where a lot of things were hidden if somebody was smart. And I don't think we've paid nearly enough attention to their movements in the plaza. And I also think there's, quite frankly, an awful lot of people who positioned themselves with cameras on Elm and actually captured things. It seems to me there were more people in the strike zone filming it than there were in other areas when you take a look at all the footage available. Why were so many people there? And that has stuck with me too, the law of averages and the number of people, quite a few of whom were women, who had cameras on the actual moment that he was fatally killed. So a lot of things I think were overlooked.
Going off that, you mentioned Gene Hill,
Hmm.
and the babushka. You sort of position them together, you suggesting that they exited at the same time, possibly. That was
There's
interesting
no,
to me.
yeah, there's no question that they did. And now why that is, do I know what Jean Hill was up to? Do I know why she would do that? But usually when you're at an event with your friend, because she drove to the event with supposedly with this Mary Moorman, the 2 women in the raincoats, right? And they're the closest one to Kennedy. Now Moorman amazingly snaps her camera and catches the fatal moment on a Polaroid, which is interesting because she then can give that to the police. But really bothered me tremendously. And I had no preconceived anything about Jean Hill, and she may well be an innocent bystander and nothing more. But what the photographic evidence revealed to me, and it's on my composite, which you'll probably link to, was that the babushka disappears. The babushka can be seen walking up in the Bell image away up over the grassy knoll, which, by the way, is a perfect ballistic backstop for a shot. I mean, we all know that. If you're going to shoot, you want to shoot into a blank wall of dirt, right? Not into a crowd. So if the babushka took a shot from her direction, she had a really great backstop. But then the babushka leaves first, and just a few steps behind her is Mary Moorman. Now, after shots ring out, why would she leave the woman, her friend, who she drove to the event? They both hit the dirt initially to like duck, so that they're scared. And then they stand up, and then the babushka and Hill are standing closer together, and Moorman is standing a little farther away. And why would you stand with a woman you don't really know? And then when she walks over, you go behind her off the plaza. That has troubled me. Might be nothing. But Hill was a little less than forthcoming when she described what happened. She didn't mention hitting the dirt. She said she just ran across the way. She did not. It was very studied, the way she exited, and that can be proven with the visual. So again, I think if people had reviewed more of what had really happened, perhaps some of these, with the footage that was already available, they could have challenged a few of the witness statements and said, well, you know, Ms. Hill, you really didn't exit in that way. You exited differently than you're saying. Why? What were you thinking and doing? You know, questions should have been asked, but I think the women were completely overlooked. And I also think Zapruder, everybody went for his footage. Why didn't anybody go for the supposed footage from the babushka's angle? She had the spectacular angle of the shooting, and she was aiming a camera at him when his head exploded with the final shot. Nobody went for him. Nobody went for her. I checked. I mean, there were rumors that she was sought after. She was not sought after in any way that I could document, not in the FBI files, not in the public press. So she just went off into the good night. And I just think we all know in the modern world, like, a woman couldn't walk away from that kind of shot and not be questioned, not become a person of interest. But that's what happened in 1963.
We'll get back to the women in a second. I just want to ask, in your opinion, what's your take? Do you hold stock in claims that the footage, for instance, of Zapruder has been altered to some extent? What's your opinion on that?
My personal opinion, and again, maybe there are people who spent more time on this, but I have not been able to see anything that to me looks like an alteration in the Zapruder film. And I say that as a person who has actually worked quite extensively in Super 8. I have a lot of experience in Super 8 footage. I shot Super 8 for, I think, at least 2 or maybe 3 of my feature films. I personally have in my basement right now probably 5 or 6 Super 8 cameras, including some professional ones, including some ones I bought to see if they were the one that Maria Muchmore was filming with. I am experienced at what it looks like when you blow it up, when you duplicate it, and Zapruder's original was given to Life magazine. As soon as they had to make a duplicate for the FBI, that was a bad mistake, because that footage will not look as good. So right there was a bit of tampering, because never should the FBI have accepted an inferior copy in 1963. It's going to be much grainier, and the original would have had a lot more resolution. So that's where I think some degradation immediately occurred. But I have not seen frames. I haven't seen that kind of, erosion of quality from an intentional point of view, other than that, not taking the best quality on the day one, which is a bad mistake. Another thing about Zapruder, though, that troubles me a bit is, Zapruder was in the dress industry, right? And boy, almost a whole lot of people who were holding a camera and shot The Fatal Moment were also in the dress industry. That's another thing nobody seemed to have ever looked at. You have Wilma Bond, you have Maria Muchmore. A lot of these people were in the garment industry, and that's like just the law of averages. Some of them had worked in places where Zapruder had also worked. So with the cameras and who was on Dealey Plaza with the cameras at The Fatal Moment, if you were planning something like this, and if you were an intelligence organization, it would be very helpful if somebody had documented it and you had control of that footage. That would be helpful. So that's always stuck in my mind, that it would be helpful to have. Just then you'd know who was there, what random person, what went wrong. So I've kept in my mind that if you were planning it, it wouldn't be a bad idea to have somebody film it.
Now, speaking of the law of averages, the Civil Air Patrol pops up
Mm.
uh, very frequently, at least in my readings. Did you notice? Did you find any come under suspicion of that organization at all in your research?
So I'm not suspicious of the Civil Air Patrol as an organization, but any organization can, and especially government affiliated organizations, as I've learned kind of the hard way, can supply cover for spies. It's very helpful for spies to receive cover, and they often receive it through a government agency or an agency that has an affiliation or a friendly fellow traveling relationship with our government. So I would say that goes for whether it's the Mercury 13 that I've discussed, NASA. Spies are often given diplomatic cover, as we all know. So I think aviation has always had a long tie with spying. So it's not that I'm suspicious of the Civil Air Patrol, but I believe that the Cold War intelligence apparatus had a whole lot of tentacles going with aviation. I mean, they have to buy and outfit spy planes. They need to collaborate with NASA. It's industrial suppliers for the wars. I mean, that's just a really cozy relationship there. And so that actually, and then if my theory is correct about Jerry Cobb or Jerry June, possibly also being the agent QJ Win. The agent QJ Win and the story about QJ Win has a whole lot of tentacles into the world of aviation, from the Lumumba, where there was surveillance happening with the plane, and the various players in the Lumumba QJ Win story were involved in aviation. That was part of that story. Aviation just has so many tentacles. A lot of the attacks on Castro and the leafleting over his country was all being dropped out of, planes. There was a lot of aviation covert activity with our, dueling with Castro, so to speak. In the book, Catherine Tafe, fascinating female spy, which I also believe to be Jerry June, was trying to hoodwink Castro by selling him $12 million of planes, and then seizing that money or tying up that money in a Swiss account in an escrow, and then slow walking and never delivering the planes to try to keep him in limbo for as long as possible. So aviation, I think, and spying are like a little bit hand in glove at a certain level. And that doesn't mean everybody who has a private plane isn't spying. And it doesn't mean I think the Civil Air Patrol is questionable. But I think aviation and spying are very much linked.
I do want to go back to women
Mhm.
before I lose you. And you
Sure.
know, the babushka sequence reminds me a bit of Violet Gibson, who was the Irish nationalist, I suppose you can call her, who tried to take out Mussolini. It's chronicled in the book, "The Woman Who Shot Mussolini," and I recommend folks to go find that. But there's women show up not just in Dealey Plaza, but there's, I believe it's Victoria Adams says, I came down the stairs and I didn't see anybody like Oswald coming down the stairwell, and her testimony was really played with, for instance. And then you mentioned Jean Hill and Mary Mormon in the Marie Muchmore film, but there's more than that. Women populate at almost every turn of the narrative. There's a woman character, if you will. Let's talk, if we can, about Ruth Paine and Marilyn Moret. You do a very compelling image comparison of the two. Tell us a little bit about where you came down on those two and your thoughts with those two figures.
What led me into that, which is important, because I didn't just jump in and go, wow, I want to be suspicious of Ruth Paine. There's a lot of reasons to be suspicious of Ruth Paine. My concern about the Paines generated when I learned that Jerry Cobb, now Jerry in the chapter 1 of my book tells me that she was at Redbird Airport trying to escape Dallas right after the killing of Kennedy, and she describes what sounds very much like a getaway flight. That's what sent me on this quest into JFK assassination, and the fact that I believed her to be the spy named June Cobb. So if she is those two things, then her being in Dallas is very problematic. Well, add to the problems. Okay, the Payne family was working and had, I guess, some ownership of Bell Helicopter. So Michael Payne was, his father was evidently the inventor of that craft, and that was their livelihood, or his livelihood, and Ruth was a stay-at-home mom. So now Jerry, in 1963, shows up at Bell Helicopter, where she begins working with that company. So she takes a commercial license to get her commercial license in like an immersive, 6-week long course. Then she stays on to test the craft and practice for the Paris Air Show. So that places Jerry in Dallas working at Bell Helicopter right at the very time when the Paynes met Oswald. Now that's what piqued my interest, because now the Paynes had that speedy, speed dial friendship where Mrs. Payne glommed on to Marina Oswald intensely, and I've read all the letters. I found those letters to be very troubling in the nature of just that too fast, too soon friendship that almost sounded with almost romantic overtones or some kind of emotional ensnarement, the sense of that kind of thing. Because this woman, Marina, would presumably be vulnerable, not speaking our language here, being from Russia. So Ruth Payne glommed onto her and then invites the family into the house. Now Michael Payne is paying for them. So all of that became very troubling. Many people before me have been troubled about Ruth Payne, so I'm certainly not the first. My problem with it was Jerry's proximity to Bell and Jerry's proximity to all of this stuff. And that made me want to look into Ruth. When I looked into Ruth, I had started to compile like every interesting woman who was never really looked at. When I found a woman in the case, I started to pull up a picture, if I could, on genealogy. And I found Marilyn Murrett, the cousin of Lee Harvey Oswald. Now this woman, Marilyn Murrett, supposed to be, perhaps Oswald was not a wealthy family. So this Marilyn Murrett is schooling all over the world, in Paris, the Sorbonne, Milan, Italy. She's getting degrees supposedly everywhere. I couldn't prove any of those degrees that she supposedly claimed to the FBI she had. She's a globetrotter, and she then was written up in a major column, a major syndicated news column, that she was on a defectors list to Russia, that she was a most wanted American defector. This was a list being presented to LBJ after the assassination. That's the same defection list that Oswald himself was on, which was why they were looking. Now, this has all been written off as, oh, maybe these reporters didn't see the right list. Well, they named her and they didn't even know that she was Oswald's cousin. So she becomes very interesting when you know that about her, right? So simply when I looked at the photograph of her and Ruth Payne, and knowing what I knew about Jerry and June, remember that I had already had a witness who knew June Cobb, the spy, and pointed to Jerry Cobb's picture identifying Jerry. The amount of disguise that was being used back then was pretty rudimentary, evidently, right? That's what my research showed. So when I pulled up that photo of Marilyn Murrett, I can tell you what, I didn't know what else to do with it. I just kind of put it in the book, like, just let people look at that and see what they think of those pictures. Because I found it to be very, very troubling on top of everything else that I'd learned. I think there's something very suspicious about Ruth Payne. I don't think anybody's ever gotten to the bottom of the story of Ruth Payne. She's very much of a single shooter person, and that's what she puts out there. And of course, she claims no involvement, and she doesn't believe Oswald had any other conspirators. But I think there's a lot of smoke there. And I put my photo out to be just a piece of information for other researchers to continue to, assess and look at. I personally don't think I've nailed what's going on there, but I think it is troubling and problematic. And I think Marilyn Murrett is a bizarre story. I mean, she's probably more bizarre than the Ruth Payne story.
I'll just say, Ruth Payne went to school at Antioch College in Yellow Springs, which is in the 10 miles from Wright Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, where Walter Dornberger landed in Operation Paperclip and got involved in Bell Helicopter. So last couple of questions, and these are just a lightning round, if you will. So
sure.
Yes or
I'll
no?
keep it short. Yep.
Okay. Did Nelson Rockefeller's Office of Inter-American Affairs pop up at all in your research, to your memory?
I think mostly when I think about that, I think of two things. Financing a lot of the Latin American interest, right? And Jerry and June were very involved in Latin America. And I think the Rockefeller, angle on this was they were really interested in protecting some of the financial concerns down in South America. So that, and the involvement of the policies therein. So yes, those things came up, but they didn't lead to any especially dark places. I didn't have any special place to put that in the book, but that was the angle that I looked into.
How about David Ferry, Civil Air Patrol, Eastern Airlines pilot, Lee Oswald's mentor in New Orleans? Anything came up on him?
I probably should have done more work on him. There is that Civil Air Patrol connection, right? And, I did not find very much. It's interesting, Jerry Cobb and June avoided New Orleans as a location, right? I mean, as far as tracing and pegging them in New Orleans at any space and time. June Cobb did report once to the FBI there initially in the 50s, where she was tattling on her supposed fiance's drug lab. And Jerry Cobb has a weird certificate as, like, I think an honorary citizen of, they honored her in New Orleans for what, I don't know. So she had a connection there, but I have very little information to directly connect my main interested characters to New Orleans, and therefore that gave me some trouble connecting them to David Ferry, but I probably should have pursued it further.
One last question, and readers would know this, pops up throughout the book, but I wanted just to get you while I have you. Did you fear for your life?
The scariest part was very early when I didn't know anything about the landscape of the Kennedy case, and I, of course, was worried about the person I was dealing with. The moment where I got the most concerned was really as I was unfurling that Jerry Cobb's life was to a great extent a lie. It wasn't total lie because she did many of the things she said. But I remember kind of Googling, like, wow, can an older woman be dangerous? And there are instances where when you're unspooling somebody's fraud, if you are the investigator unspooling a fraud, you are in some danger at that point for what they call fraud. What's it called? Fraud detection homicide. Like if somebody has something to really protect, you can be in danger. So at first I worried, what could happen, and I was nervous, but the more I got further, I kept going, and the more I got further into it, the more I suspected that deep down Jerry might want me to be finding out her story, and she might want me to ultimately tell what I was finding, perhaps after her life, which is when it happened. I wasn't able to get it together before then, so there was no choice. So I would have to say I did a little bit. I don't want to sound like a kook or a paranoid, but I certainly wondered about, unspooling something so, if somebody was really hiding something, who all was hiding it and what lengths would they go to? But ultimately, I came to the conclusion that I would have been in much more danger if I was unspooling this in 1978. I think unspooling it now was a very different thing, with most of the players dead and the ones who were still alive maybe being okay with some of this coming out, which is the conclusion that I came to.
Mary Haverstick, author of A Woman I Know. Thank you for being with me.
James, thank you. Appreciate it.
And stop the record.
Okay.